Pirates are mostly known for winning their biscuit by sea, but in the 17th century, they were so numerous, well-trained, and put up against an enemy weak enough that they were able to take on and conquer entire cities. Using innovative new tactics and state-of-the-art equipment, they were able to defeat armies many times their own size, and execute horrendous treatments upon the people they occupied. Driven by a hatred for Spain and religious zeal, they were the Buccaneers, and this is how they fought on land. Buccaneer warfare looked both familiar and different to the conventional armies of the time. They marched in organized fashion under banner and drum, but could easily spread out into skirmishing formations, fire from cover, and use smoke to prelude an assault. Operating in teams of 2, their tactics are sometimes similar to modern infantry. They did not fight in this manner just because they felt like it. Everything discussed in this video in terms of Buccaneer tactics was dependent on the Caribbean terrain. Europe had been developed for centuries, turning ancient forests into fields and fertile farmland. This was the dominion of cavalry, pike formations, and booming artillery. Spin the globe over to the West Indies. The islands are more like volcanic mountains, rising from the bottom of the sea, peppered by dense vegetation, undeveloped by the hand of man. There was no space to maneuver a tercio or send forth a wing of horse, but to move lightly and strike with precision. A small but well-trained force, able to master logistics, rapid movement by sea or land, could quickly traverse the rainforest and strike at the prosperous settlements. The Buccaneers consisted of various disparate groups, banded together for the common goal of making a buck by attacking the Spanish. But their tactics derived from 3 influential groups. First of them was the namesake of the Buccaneers, a group of independent hunters on the island of Hispaniola, known in French as Buccaneer. Always hunted by the Spanish, they developed into excellent guerrilla fighters, running in the woodlands and always ready for a sudden ambush. They were swift and self-sufficient, able to last for months in the wilderness. However, they were most desired for their expert marksmanship, honed in the dangerous hunting of wild pigs and savage bulls. Next we have the soldiers of Oliver Cromwell, introduced to the Americas by the Western design of 1655. The survivors of the disastrous Hispaniola campaign managed to conquer Jamaica, where most of the army disbanded. Many of the ruthless soldiers were now without a job. Driven by political and religious convictions, they saw the conflict against the Spanish as a crusade against Catholicism, and buccaneering became an outlet to practice their violent art. Cromwell's new model army was the first to standardize the iconic red coat, and indeed, they were noted for their organization and discipline, which the veterans would likewise introduce to the Buccaneers. Lastly, we have an element which historians have seldom considered in the tactical development of the Buccaneers: Native American tribes, most notably the Carib or Kalinga. The first Anglo-French colonies of the region were built in the Lesser Antilles, dominion of the Carib. And though relations were initially friendly, they soon devolved into violence and genocide. In order to survive, the colonials had to adapt to native warfare, centered around speed, ambush, and mobility in the wild terrain. The Buccaneers did likely incorporate native tactics either through the colonials, through the hunters, or through the natives themselves. The hunters earned their nickname Buccaneer from the Buccan, a Native American barbecue used for the curing of meat and fish. They lived in huts of native design and fought in a style reminiscent of the Braves. It isn't unlikely that they picked it up from them. Finally, there were many Native Americans directly employed in Buccaneer crews, who could have passed along their tactics, just like the hunters and soldiers. Another possible source of their style of warfare comes from a place rather obvious: the ocean. Fighting between ships was essentially a siege, more reminiscent of urban combat than any field engagements. Aside from the cannons blazing off, individual soldiers and pirates dueled enemy sharpshooters with muskets. Shooters took cover behind the parts of the ship, fired and reloaded at their own pace, and favored precision over speed. This is very similar to how the Buccaneers fought on land. With the origins of the Buccaneers and their tactics covered, the rest of the video is essentially going to cover the entirety of a Buccaneer campaign. The first part covering preparations, the second their watery crossing to a target, the third their marching by land, the fourth their enemy, the Spanish, the fifth the moments before a battle, the sixth the battles themselves, the seventh assaults on fortifications, the eighth occupation, and the ninth, the finale, will discuss why pirates stopped fighting battles on land. Well, let's dive into it then. Before we go on, the channel is currently facing a serious downturn in terms of views, which the channel is dependent on for its survival. More views means that I get paid for investing on average 60 hours a week producing these videos, and in the long term, lack of views or monetary support will mean that I cannot afford to produce more videos. If you enjoy this content, it is therefore necessary that you boost it by liking, leaving a comment, sharing it, and if you're watching shortly after release, hyping it. I upload videos at least every 2 weeks and have been doing so for years, and if you don't get notified of new releases, you have to click the bell button next to the subscribe or join the Discord server where you get a notification on new releases. Channel memberships, donations, and Patreon support also helps immensely. For just $1 a month, you can enjoy all of my videos without ads. Now let's dive back into the bookies. Aside from hunters, soldiers, and Native Americans, the Buccaneers chiefly consisted of indentured servants who had either finished their terms or escaped, deserted merchant or navy sailors, a number of freed or escaped slaves, or simple adventurers, blades, and fortune seekers. In order to find employment, they would congregate in Buccaneer strongholds like Tortuga, Port Royal, or Petit Goave, where they'd have no trouble finding an enterprising captain. There were essentially two types of Buccaneer leaders, those who owned a ship and had a commission, or those who were elected. To explain the former, they might be naval officers or former merchant captains, now with a permit allowing them to attack the Spanish. Naval officers turned to buccaneering include Christopher Minks and the Chevalier de Fontenay. Of former merchants, Charles Swan is the most notable. Buccaneers would trust and respect these men, since they provided a vessel and legal front, but also because they had some experience. If the Buccaneers did not have a commander, such as if they had recently deposed one, or were just a bunch of lads gathering together for an expedition, they would elect a commander. The best candidates would present themselves and their case, and a vote would be cast as to who was the most appropriate. The Buccaneers favored experience and personal courage. They also elected one or more quartermasters, who oversaw distribution of plunder, maintaining discipline, etc. It is also notable that Buccaneer leaders were seldom called captain. Their forces usually consisted of multiple ships and companies, banded together into a fleet, with the leader of the entire force called admiral while at sea, and general by land. Only the captains of individual ships were called, let me check my notes. Captain. In preparation for the expedition, the company would acquire medicaments for the surgeon, powder and shot, food, and water. They seldom ate anything but meat, which was a significant recruitment pool for the servants, slaves, and poor sailors that often struggled to earn more than one meal a day. The nutrients of this meat-heavy diet may also have contributed to their great success. If the proponents of the carnivore diet are to be believed, maybe they'll show up in the comments. The pork and beef were the main proteins, often stolen from nearby Spanish farms, and prepared into a sort of long jerky on the aforementioned boucan, alias barbecue. Sailors loved their liquor, a must in staving away the boredom at sea. Buccaneering expeditions were quite short, often just from Tortuga or Jamaica over to Cuba or the Spanish Main, so there wasn't a huge demand for hard liquor. It would also take up space, which was limited in their small vessels. That is not to say that the Buccaneers didn't like their drink. They would spend most of their money in the taverns, not exactly on salted peanuts. And if they were somehow able to locate some wine or brandy during their looting, God help us all. A meat-heavy diet wasn't the only cause for the Buccaneers' high morale, which might have been their most important weapon. Confidence, the trust in your equipment, comrades, and abilities, is the soldier's most important trait, and it can be evidenced in the Buccaneers' initiative and aggressive tactics. This morale came from a few sources. Their egalitarian society, under which they elected their own commanders, were considered equals and free men, deserving of their slice of the profits, and free to leave whenever they wanted. Indeed, easy money was the biggest motivator. A buccaneer did not have to toil hard soil for pennies, but exchanged a spade for a musket, and reap his due in the field of war, where fortunes were gambled with dice of bone and flesh. Those willing to take the risk could earn back this bloody investment many times over, and for those who were wounded, they were compensated with a payment of silver or servants chained. When the men had been mustered, a master elected, provisions gathered, the ship tarred and greased, the boys hoisted the anchor, set the sails, and set off to their chosen target. The Caribbean is a treacherous sea, full of tiny islands, shoals, sandbars, and shallows. Large vessels were unsuitable in the region, and the Buccaneers did not have a particular need for big vessels if their only purpose was to transport them from A to B, where they attacked by land. Smaller vessels were easier to handle by the Buccaneers, who were often poor sailors, many coming from landcrab backgrounds, or altogether slothful. This came at the cost of cargo capacity. Smaller vessels carried less provisions, meaning that the men would most likely have to forage, and they could carry less plunder. To remedy this, additional ships for the carrying of plunder could be taken at the target. Comfort was another issue. Smaller vessels were cramped. If undecked, you couldn't really get up and stretch your legs whenever you wanted. They often lacked facilities for preparing hot meals and were exposed to the weather. Wind, waves, and, rain. Should have brought an umbrella. These smaller vessels included piraguas, essentially big canoes, double shallops, and smaller barks. Small vessels with a deck might be preferred. While still, small, they had a comfortable deck for walking on, which could also provide some shelter, and increased cargo capacity, with provisions likewise protected from the elements. The biggest hulls commanded by Buccaneers were typically small frigates. These were long vessels with one or two decks, of between 20 to 120 tons burthen, 3 full-rigged masts, and a couple of cannons. They provided the best comfort, cargo capacity, and all of that, while still being speedy, and the firepower allowed their limited use against certain fortifications. Of course, they were more difficult to acquire than smaller vessels, and required more skill in their handling. As aforesaid, the Buccaneers weren't the best of sailors. This can be evidenced during Morgan's Panama campaign, in which 5 of the fleet's vessels were wrecked on a reef. Most of the provisions and men were saved, apart from 10 that drowned, along with a witch brought aboard by Morgan to advise him and prophesize. It is not the only case of superstitious Buccaneers bringing magical practitioners aboard. Captain Swan had an astrologer with him from London, warning him of fire, just before the vessel was attacked by a fireship. The spook is unreal. How the Buccaneers made landfall depended on their circumstance. If they wanted to be seen, they would do so under drums and blaring trumpets. If they didn't want to be seen and planned to go by guile, they would do so silently, preferably at night or dawn. We know rather well how the Buccaneers would have been equipped on average, judging by a multitude of eyewitness descriptions and even illustrations. In terms of clothing, the average Buccaneer would have been dressed in breeches, a shirt, a jacket or light coat, topped off by a broad-brimmed hat. Socks and shoes protected them against the ground and growth, but many went barefoot for whatever reason. It usually ended up in them cutting their feet. Upon these clothes they carried their equipment, a belt around their waist holding 1 or 2 cartridge boxes, in which they kept paper cartridges of powder and shot, spare gun flints, and tools for musket maintenance. A scabbard held their cutlass, and a pistol usually lay tucked in the belt. Sometimes a second pistol, but it could also be kept in a pocket. Above the belt they would have a light mosquito net, put over their faces when sleeping. On their back they carried a knapsack, a proto-backpack usually shaped like a sausage, and made of waterproofed cloth or leather. It could either be carried by a sling across the chest, kinda like those bags you see at the gym, or as shown on this image, 2 shoulder straps like a modern backpack. Inside the pack they carried water, typically inside a wooden flask, calabash or gourd, possibly more ammunition, and provisions. Provisions included dried meat, but also a type of boiled bread or dumpling, called a doughboy, easy enough to prepare in the simple facilities aboard a small ship. Some buccaneers also carried axes, primarily a tool for breaching fortifications, various types of grenades, and the tools to light them. Pistols and cutlass aside, the buccaneers' main arm was the flintlock musket, especially an absurdly long type called the Buccaneer gun. Initially a wheellock or matchlock hunting weapon, introduced to Hispaniola by the French or Dutch. It had by the mid-17th century developed into a fine flintlock piece that would be the favored weapon of naval sharpshooters until the mid-18th century. The Hispaniola hunters made the weapon famous for its accuracy, and though other fusees and even matchlocks may have been used on some occasion, the lack of descriptions of pirates using matchlocks, I really haven't encountered any, compared to the countless descriptions of their usage of the fusee or flintlock, really hammers home that this was their favorite weapon. The flintlock musket was crucial to their style of warfare. A soldier on a short campaign needed as many as 6 yards of slow match to operate, whereas a fusilier needed only a couple of flints. The matchlock had to be lit with a living flame, whereas the flintlock could just be cocked and fired, making it perfect for the speedy and unpredictable war in the jungle, where an arrow or horseman could just fly out of nowhere at you. When the Buccaneers had landed, they had to decide what to do with their ships. If they planned on returning home, it was best to keep them concealed or under guard, and not stave too far off them. A smaller port or castle might be occupied as a forward base to keep the ships in. If they planned on acquiring new ships, the old ones could be burned or drilled full of holes. This was especially common for buccaneers marching over the Isthmus of Darien for attacks in the Pacific Ocean. It was done to prevent the ships from falling into Spanish hands. Next they had to decide if they should reach their target by foot or by boat. Many inland locations in the Spanish Main were connected by rivers, which the buccaneers could reach from traveling by canoe. They could take their own canoes, build new ones, or acquire them from Native Americans by purchase or theft. If there were no waterways, the buccaneers would march. Intelligence, that is, information on the local area, was vital for success in the fog of war. This was provided by people familiar with the region in which they were campaigning. In the best case, they had been recruited before the expedition set off. Their backgrounds and reasons for knowing the area are often as interesting as the buccaneers themselves, and I will list a handful. Juan Gallardo was a native to Nicaragua, trained as a pilot, and enslaved by the Spanish for the crime of murder. Encountering the company of Henry Morgan, Gallardo agreed to join them in return for guiding them to the city of Granada, which they proceeded to ransack. John Russell was an old buccaneer turned bayman, a lumberjack harvesting dyewood in Mexico. Here he was captured by the Spanish and sold into slavery in the city of Veracruz. Making his escape, Russell ended up in a filibuster fleet under Nicholas van Horn, agreeing to guide him to their target, the city in which he had been enslaved. When the filibusters occupied the city, Russell located a home of his former master, John Murphy, murdering his wife. Another one of the filibusters, likewise having served as a guide, was a former citizen of Veracruz. During the occupation, he tracked down and killed his ex. And I thought I was the toxic boyfriend. I had some other example, but I forgot about it. Oh yeah, now I remember. Henry Morgan attacked Maracaibo after he was advised to do so by a former crewman of Lolone, who had sacked the lake a couple of years prior. The crewman thus had experience with the location, where all the fortifications and targets were. Relying on veteran knowledge was key to Buccaneer success. Guides could naturally be acquired during the expedition itself. Many of them were simple prisoners, fishermen, farmers, anyone unfortunate to get caught by these grubby sea dogs. Slaves might be promised their freedom in return for betraying their masters, and many of them did. Native Americans were often some of the best guides, and buccaneers attacking the Isthmus of Darien would align themselves with a local tribe, the Cuna, enemy of Spain. The Kuna not only knew the terrain, but location of Spanish settlements worthwhile to attack. On some occasions, even the leaders of the tribe would accompany their piratical allies. The Buccaneers bore a strong resemblance to European mercenary and regular forces in how they marched, both inherited from their Cromwellian connection, but also soldiers of fortune from the British Civil Wars and 30 Years' War. The entire army was divided into companies, each led by its captain, marching in close, orderly ranks. Drummers beat the pace, and every company had its own flag. Morgan's army at Panamá had green flags, with a number of white discs on it, corresponding to the number of the company. First company had 1 disc, second company 2, etc. Other Buccaneer companies had more varied flags. Basil Ringrose described green flags, red flags, a striped flag, a flag with ribbons, and a striped flag with an arm holding a sword. National flags were very common, like the White Banner of France, Dutch tricolour, or English Cross of St. George. In 1688, a filibuster company in Mexico even marched with a red flag, carrying the dreaded skull and bones. Soldiers nowadays can rely on a sling to carry their firearm with ease. The sling was invented at some point in the late 17th century, and initially designed for grenadiers, so that they could sling their musket aside when preparing and throwing a bomb. Buccaneers had no such luxuries, and carried their muskets by hand. Most common was to rest a bit just below the lock on your shoulder, with your hand on the butt as a counterweight. Other images show soldiers carrying their muskets the opposite way, their hand holding onto the barrel. The lock and priming would also have to be protected against moisture. This could be done by walking with the musket cradled between your arms like a baby, hand over the lock. The muzzle could also be plugged with a stopper, and the lock wrapped with a protective cloth. Even though the Buccaneers had many former slaves among them, they were not above keeping slaves themselves. During the expeditions, they would perform various menial assignments, and during the march, they would carry supplies and often their masters' knapsacks. The carry-weight served as a ball and chain, but slaves would nonetheless escape on a basis not too infrequent. The front of the marching train was held by a vanguard, known as the Forlorn Hope. That's a bit gloomy. This was another military tradition the Buccaneers inherited. By marching in the front, the Forlorn were expected to take the brunt of any assault or ambush, scout ahead, capture prisoners for intelligence, and lead a charge into the fray. For this reason, the general was often expected to lead the Forlorn himself, or he might volunteer to do so in order to impress his men. The rest of the Forlorn were elected by lot or the cast of dice, and rarely do they seem to actually have been given a special reward, unless they were wounded, I suppose. They always had to walk on the alert, and in regular armies, they would march with their flintlocks cocked, ready to just aim and fire. The Buccaneer armies may have been joined by dogs. The hunters kept dogs for the tracking and capture of wild beasts, and this breed of bloodhound had initially been used to hunt and devour Arawak Indians on Hispaniola. During King Philip's War, a company of ex-buccaneers named Mosley's Privateers were hired as mercenaries by the English governor. Their years of waging war in the West Indian rainforest made them experts at swamp and woodland fighting, and they used dogs for tracking the Indian prey. One woman was allegedly thrown to the hounds and eaten alive. There are better ways to go. Dogs could be used to track smaller targets, say a guide, a spy, or a scout, or to detect ambushes. During one of the fights on Tortuga, a Spanish ambush was discovered by a barking dog. Might just have been a random mutt, just like the one keeping me up at night.
Alright, motherfucker, so a couple weeks ago I shot the fucking dog that lives across the way.
The army might split up. One force could go by boat, another by land. One could occupy a small village, another could scout and gather intelligence, occupy a forward post, and so on. On their march to the target, the Buccaneers would ransack smaller targets along the way. Prisoners would be captured and interrogated for any information about the target, enemy forces, or their ambushes. Minor loot might be taken, with provisions being the most invaluable. It was often deliberate policy for the Buccaneers to not bring many or even any provisions with them during their campaigns, forcing them instead to live off the land. Small hamlets could be looted of their flour, meat, legumes, vegetables, and fruits. Wine, if encountered, would be consumed to an excess, often distracting the Buccaneers from their main assignments. After sacking Panama, Morgan sent Robert Searles to capture the Santissima Trinidad, which had escaped with most of the city's treasure. Searles and his men took a few barks, but got distracted by a couple jars of wine and a group of Spanish women. Food could also be foraged from the wilderness. Early colonists and soldiers to the Caribbean had been distrustful of the local foodstuffs, since it was difficult for them to ascertain what was safe to eat and when. And in those days of yore, it was a matter of life and death. During the Cromwellian expedition to Hispaniola, the soldiers marched without water, and they had to slake their thirst from oranges. The fruits must have been bad somehow, or the soldiers consumed something else, for dysentery had soon spread across the camp. Speaking of water, staying hydrated was a life and death matter on the march in a hot jungle, your back stoved with provisions and equipment. By reducing the water they carried, Buccaneers could march quicker, but they needed to know of places to refill. That was the benefit of traveling along lakes, rivers, etc. Same as with fruits, their best option was having natives with them, who knew what was safe to eat, where you could fill up on fresh water, and so on. By the 1670s, the Buccaneers had become connoisseurs of wild fruit and game, which they hunted, mammals, birds, you name it. Provisions could also be given by natives, with the King of Darien giving the Buccaneers sugar cane to suck on. Even still, the Buccaneers were often reduced to thirst and starvation. Water sources might prove infected or too salty, and food nowhere to be found. During Morgan's Panama expedition, the Buccaneers were forced to cut apart leather bags, pound the strips until tender, broil, and eat it. Other cases describe them eating seaweed and barnacles, and should any unfortunate farm animal fall into their hands, they weren't picky. Donkey, dog, cat, you name it, they ate it. After a good night of marching, sweating, getting stung by insects and eating leather, it was time for a good night's rest. They did not carry tents with them, and often just slept under the stars or cover of trees. Perhaps with a sea gown, blanket, or at least a mosquito net, likely using their knapsack as a pillow. If the weather was bad, they might construct simple lean-ins using locally harvested materials, sticks of any size and kind, roofed with large palm leaves, which were otherwise used to thatch permanent dwellings in the Caribbean. Sleep tight, my sweet rovers, for the enemy is watching with ire and envy. Give an applause to our antagonist, the Spanish. Woohoo. Their situation in the West Indies and world overall wasn't great in the 17th century, being overextended, underfunded, and suffering a population decline. Spanish defenses in the Caribbean were usually insufficient, and though their commanders and soldiers often fought bravely enough, it was seldom enough to counter the unconventional stratagems of the Buccaneers. The core of Spanish defenses were regular soldiers, usually sent over from Europe to garrison a castle. Buccaneers regarded Biscayers as the best, but local soldiers were usually of African origin. They might be trained in gunnery or musketry, and uniforms were not a thing until the early 18th century, apart from a red sash around their waist or a red feather in the hat. On some occasion, they might wear mail coats or gambeson, and even the iconic morion, but armor was best against native weapons, and most Spanish soldiers appeared indistinguishable from the ones of other nations. This painting shows the Spanish conquest of St. Kitts in 1629, and shows us what Spanish soldiers would have looked like in the earlier decades of the buccaneering age. Their favorite weapon was the matchlock musket. In the early century, it was so heavy as to require a forked rest to aim reliably, but as the decades passed by, it became lighter and held only by hand. Spain's forces were bulked up by local militias, urban denizens, laborers, farmers, and farmhands. Their training was poor, and their morale was poorer. But some, when cornered, could put up fierce resistance, especially if their homes were directly threatened. Worst of all was their armament. The lucky ones were kitted out with rudimentary firearms, most common being the arquebus. This was a short, light-caliber matchlock or wheelock firearm, seriously outdated by the 1660s. These were supplemented by carbines, another short weapon, and fowling pieces used for hunting birds. The problem with all of these weapons was that they were underpowered and lacked range. You were lucky to get any firearm at all. Most Spanish militiamen were forced to use machetes, rapiers, or the spear, sometimes with a shield. These were easily picked off at a distance by the Buccaneers, but if the spearmen could close the gap, they might be deadly effective. During the Cromwellian expedition, a Spanish officer named Capitan Payano related the following. Our firearms, which we had in the ambuscade, killed none of the enemy. These lances are the most effective weapon which cruel industry has yet invented against humankind. In this battle, we took no prisoners, for these lances do not wound, they kill. They are handled by men who use no other weapons, and with them they face a bull or a boar, fierce animals. I prefer 100 lancers to 1,000 firearms. The best weapon up the cuffed Spanish sleeve was the cavalrymen. Their horse consisted both of light melee cavalry and elite ranged cavalry, dragoons. The light cavalry, or lancers, were, as you might guess, equipped with a spear. Best of them were La Cinquantaine of Santo Domingo, meaning the 50, so nicknamed by the French because only half of the company of 100 would be active at once, prowling the woodlands for Buccaneer to assault. The dragoons were elite soldiers brought in from Europe, and somewhat of a rarity to Buccaneers. Luckily so, because when they met them, they were often outmatched. Though they could fight with sword and pistol, the dragoons' primary arm was a short escopeta, or flintlock carbine. These seem to have been rifled, for at the Battle of Arica in modern-day Chile, the Buccaneers remarked how they were outranged by their opponents' firearms. Last of all, Spanish forces were usually augmented by Indian auxiliaries. These came from tribes vassalized by Spain and converted to Catholicism, and provided a number of warriors to serve in local defense. Along with light cavalry, they made excellent scouts and ambushers, but could also be seen on fortifications. Their favorite weapon was the bow and arrow, not too inefficient against the unarmored Buccaneer, especially when fired in a volley, and auxiliaries were often used to great effect. At Lake Maracaibo, Lolone's landing at Puerto de las Barbacoas was repelled by a swarm of arrows from Paraute archers. When assaulting a Spanish fortification at Santa Maria, Darien, Captain Richard Sawkins was personally struck in the head by an arrow, and survived. Must have had a significant effect on morale, for both sides, but in opposing ways. Whilst the Spanish forces were deficient in training and equipment, they usually had numbers on their side, and could call in reinforcements if they were able to stall the Buccaneers for long enough. Therefore, their tactics usually revolved around defending fortified positions. Ambushes, or ambuscades, as they were known from the Spanish ambuscado, was their other favorite tactic. Minor trench works would be set up in the woodlands on the side of a road, often kitted with artillery. The road would be blocked, either to stop the Buccaneers or to divert them towards the ambush. From their positions, the guns would fire and the lancers would spring forth. However, these were usually bested by the Buccaneers, who often learned of the ambush location through prisoners. The ambuscade could also be given away by the smell of matchlocks, noise of bandoliers, or doggies, as aforementioned. Once discovered, the Buccaneers might go down the road anyway and just take the attack, albeit prepared, or move into the rough terrain, hacking their way forward with cutlasses and machetes, and either ambush the ambuscade or just go around it. Cavalry ambushes were more efficient, since they were not dependent on a prepared position. Optimally, they would strike when the Buccaneers were unprepared and disorganized, such as encamped, resting, or collecting wood and water. So too would they use various unconventional tactics. At Panamá, they released a stampede of beeves to roll over the Buccaneers. In other cases, they set fire to fields of grass to divert, scare off, or choke the enemy, and they were sometimes accused of using poisoned bullets. The Buccaneers considered this dishonorable, even as they decapitated prisoners or used bullets they had chewed on. These were seen as just as dishonorable, as they would cause horrific internal injuries, more difficult to remedy. When the opposing sides had been lined up for battle, the final preparations would be made. The more pious among them might fall on their knees and pray, whilst the less pious might take a shot of liquid courage. Camaraderie above all, the men might pass by each other and shake hands. Finally, the general might hold a speech to rouse his fellows for battle. When they were ready, there was nothing more to do but fall upon the enemy. Well, that segment was unusually short, so let's take a musical break or something whilst I take a drinking break. Cheers. The Buccaneers would essentially fight in two different ways, depending on the need of the situation, the training and cohesion of the men, their backgrounds and experiences. For the most part, the Buccaneers after 1670 appear to have been so seasoned as to be able to fight in whatever fashion the situation demanded. These fashions included open order and closed order. Their open order warfare is really what distinguished them from regular forces at the time. This means that they did not fight in close formations, but spread out, aiming, firing, and moving on a smaller group initiative. Of course, it happened more often than believed even in Europe. The big set-piece battles of massive formations squaring off in an open field were relatively far in between, with most engagements being woodland skirmishes, ambushes against supply lines, and sieges. These struggles would have pitted small groups of men against each other, forcing them to use cover and more unconventional means of fighting, even if the Buccaneers seemed to have perfected this style of warfare. At the core of their open order warfare was a fighting pair, that is, two men. They would move together and watch each other's backs, and they would alternate their fire. One man aimed while the other reloaded, and did not fire until his mate was ready. Thus they would always keep up a repeating fire on the enemy, keeping them suppressed and preventing initiative, allowing the Buccaneers to close the gap. Their style of warfare was rapid and aggressive, with them running from cover to cover, concealment to concealment, be it trees, bushes, rocks or debris, and into the Spanish trenches. Open ground was avoided at all cost, and they would throw themselves to the ground just before the Spanish opened fire, even if the enemy soon picked up on this and learned to aim low. Artificial concealment was created from the smoke of their black powder muskets, much like modern forces using smoke grenades, and the sulphurous redoux was used to prelude a movement, assault, or charge into melee. Accuracy was the most important component of their tactics, with multiple references to their precision. Hit ratio was further improved by loading their muskets with multiple shots. The key was to take out key targets, prioritizing artillery, cavalry, and officers. However, neither could reloading be neglected. And for situations especially hectic, they had developed a rapid loading technique particular to the flintlock, in which they shut the frizzen, pour down powder and shot, and slam the musket butt against the ground to force the load home. This technique was difficult to practice with a fouled firearm, one that had been fired multiple times and allowed powder residue to gather in the bore. And for these, they had to trust in the old ramrod. These could break during especially furious ramming, so a canny Buccaneer kept multiple on him. Of course, their most reliable boost to reloading was their early adoption of the paper cartridge, which combined powder, shot, and wad in one reliable unit. Regular forces still relied on wooden powder flasks, bullet, and wad pouches, mostly because reload speed was not considered a crucial component of standard warfare until the 18th century. In short, Buccaneers operated in teams of two, using alternating fire, a superior reload speed and accuracy, to take out or suppress their enemy. Cover was used to shield themselves, and when the enemy was weakened or demoralized, smoke was used as cover to prelude a push or charge into melee. The Spanish might adapt to some of their tactics, such as aiming low when the Buccaneers ducked, but the biggest strength of the Rovers was their ability to be flexible, improvise, and adjust. The Governor-General of Costa Rica wrote the following in 1686. "We were very well prepared to receive them, but the way of fighting practiced by these men did so much astonish ours, that we could not make that resistance we had promised ourselves we should do. The biggest threat to loose order was cavalry, which could easily swoop in and cut down the spread out shooters. To counter cavalry, the skirmishers could take cover, pick off the horsemen, or run into nearby woodlands, where few horsemen dared to pursue. However, the best way to counter cavalry was the use of formations. During the Battle of Arica, the Buccaneers seemed to have fought in loose order, but during their retreat from the city, showed their ability to fight in close rank as well. When assaulted by Spanish cavalry, Bartholomew Sharp organized the company into a circular formation, preventing the rapid horsemen from outflanking them. Only a few fusiliers fired at a time to keep up a constant volume. Had they all fired at once, they would have been done for. The wounded were kept in the center of the formation, possibly reloading and passing around their muskets to further improve the rate of fire. Most impressively is that this formation was mobile, with the Buccaneers slowly retreating back to their landing. It shows their discipline, training, and experience. Many in this company were old veterans of Morgan, possibly Cromwellians. And Morgan had deployed a similar formation during his assault on Puerto Príncipe, Cuba. Entering a large open plain before the city, Morgan ordered his troops into a semicircle. The enemy sent in the cavalry to outflank them, but the Buccaneers were able to fend them off with continuous, accurate fire. The Buccaneers never stopped in their advance, and when they took out the governor, enemy morale shattered. Most of them retreated, many picked off as they ran. Buccaneers could also fight in regular closed order, like you might see in a period flick like Barry Lyndon or The Patriot. That's the one with the funny British guy laughing. These formations were never really practiced with matchlocks, since you risked setting off the powder charges of the guy next to you, and matchlock shooters usually operated somewhat independently, in conjunction with pike formations. The flintlock and cartridge box allowed musketeers to stand more tightly packed, making their volleys more accurate and compact. Buccaneers might prefer close rank for whatever reason, because they weren't trained enough to skirmish, or simply because they were used to it. Even in formation, the tactical goal remained the same: aggression, precision, and speed. Constant volume was kept up not only by their cartridges and loading techniques, but by dividing the company into ranks. It wasn't just one single line, but 2 or 3 rows of soldiers in lines. The first rank fired and then knelt to reload, allowing the second rank to fire over the heads of the first rank, keeping up a constant fire. It must also be mentioned here that a constant volume of fire is more terrifying than a single discharge. In the latter case, there is a big boom, followed by silence. Whereas with the former, fire is constant and unpredictable. Another formation practice was the counter-march. The first rank fired and then moved to the back line to reload. The second line then moved forward and fired. Using this maneuver, they could both fire and advance simultaneously. That is how the Buccaneers met their opponent in the open field, which is so often why the Spanish preferred to defend from fortified positions. However, they might not expect what the Buccaneers had to bring. Buccaneer ships were, as a rule, not suited for naval bombardment. The common vessels described previously were small, poorly armed with light cannons, and weak enough to get blasted to shreds by the heavy artillery deployed behind fortifications. That is not to say that they didn't try to assault fortifications by sea on some occasions. François L'Aulnay, having failed in his landing at Puerto de las Barbacoas, made a direct assault on his target, the city of Gibraltar. The fleet of Buccaneer ships, consisting of 2 ketches and 6 sloops, all very small vessels, bombarded the city for 8 days. What allowed them to attack the city in this fashion was that it was unfortified. Its only defenses were earthen ramparts, equipped with cannons, seemingly too weak to sink the Buccaneer ships. The defenders were able to kill 40 and wound an additional 30, a significant toll, but the Buccaneers' bombardment had destroyed much of the city and littered the streets with corpses, including the governor. Henry Morgan planned on doing a similar assault on the city of Cartagena de las Indias, using his heavily armed Oxford, had she not blown up. Very sad, I cry every day. Cartagena wasn't assaulted again until 1697, when the Baron de Pointy augmented his 1,200-strong force with 650 buccaneers. Exquemelin had actually gone out of retirement to join his assault as a surgeon. The Baron's plan was to open fire at the fort with his heavily armed warship, giving cover for the Buccaneers to make landfall and assault it. This plan never came to fruition, with the French instead making landfall and moving artillery onto a raised position, laying siege to the fortified town. 3 days later, the Spanish surrendered. It was exceedingly uncommon for buccaneers to bring artillery ashore, and laying siege to heavily fortified settlements was not in their rulebook. I don't think they had the patience. The preferred stratagem was to take cities by stealth and surprise, attacking at night, dawn, or during religious festivals, when everyone was distracted, sleeping, or otherwise drunk. The attack on Veracruz in 1683 was a masterful demonstration of infiltration and stealth. In the evening, the Spanish leadership were occupied with a feast, and they ignored the sighting of the filibuster fleet, dismissing it as allies. The filibusters made landfall. Their forlorn hope climbed the walls of the neglected fortifications. Some of the Spanish members in their ranks had disguised themselves as locals. Most of the sentinels were asleep. With the fortifications occupied, the remaining force moved into the city, distributed themselves across the districts in smaller fighting units. At 4 a.m., when the sun began to dawn, a Spanish lookout was roused by someone coming up his ladder. The strange man asked for a light, and then shot the lookout dead. That was the signal. The Buccaneers burst into action, arresting anyone who tried to escape and killing all that resisted. 2 columns of 80 filibusters arrested the governor in his mansion, and the city had been taken. So in short, the goal of an attack by stealth was to get into the city, dispose of the sentries, get the rest of the army inside, disperse among the districts, arrest the city officials, commence the attack at dawn or in the early morning, when people were still sleeping, but there was enough light to prevent internal confusion and friendly fire. According to William Dampier, Buccaneers would never attack a settlement if the alarm had been sprung and defenses mustered. Whilst this was preferred, Dampier is wrong, and Buccaneers did very often attack fortified places that had been prepared for their coming. Instead of laying siege, the Buccaneers would rush the fortifications, get over them, and win the day. Simple enough, right? There were a multitude of Spanish defense systems, ranging from simplistic to advanced and even unconventional. Most simple were trenches and breastworks. These were essentially long pits, with the dug-up earth thrown in front of the trench to form a barrier. They were most often erected as a forward position to musketeers, but some might be equipped with artillery. A trench system would be dug around a town in lack of better defenses, or even as a forward position for a castle. Trenches and breastworks were countered by giving fire from cover, until the enemy were suppressed and enough smoke produced. The Buccaneers then charged into the trenches, hacking and bludgeoning. A small force might outflank the trench work, and if the trench was straight, they might be able to fire down the entire line from its flank. For this purpose they would load their muskets with multiple projectiles, such as a bullet and 9 smaller ones, making it near impossible to miss such an exposed enemy. Streets might be lined with barricades, consisting of any old wagons, boxes, sacks and hides. They were either used as a defensive position, forcing the attackers to scale or take down the barricade, making them susceptible to the guns and spears of the enemy, all the while fire could come from the surrounding buildings. The defenders could just retreat to the next barricade. The barricades could also be used to divert the attackers into a different street, where an ambush might lie in wait. A bonus type of fortification were the bushes of barbed thorns, called raqueltes, encountered by François Lollinet in Central America. He was totally unable to go through or over the bushes, forcing him to go around instead, and right into an enemy ambush. Aside from this particular location, I've never heard of the raqueltes being used, even though they seem to have been very effective, like an early sort of barbed wire. Palisades are an ancient type of fortification, consisting of decently sized poles or stakes tied together, placed in the earth, and set into a fence, sometimes with a battlement or loopholes for musketeers. Buccaneers would assault them in a similar manner to trench works, but since they couldn't climb over the palisade itself, they would either attack the gate, chopping it down with axes, or they would throw grappling hooks over the palisades and pull down individual stakes, until they had produced a breach for them to run through. "Once more, Miss Moneypenny, into the breach." Yes, that is me quoting Sean Connery, quoting, which one is it? Shakespeare, yeah, there we go. Bigger than palisades were stockades, similar to palisades, but made up of entire logs instead of just stakes. These were strong enough to be organized into proper walls or wooden forts, kitted out with towers and cannon emplacements. These were only succeeded in strength and resilience by stone forts, the biggest of whom were called castles. The Spanish had been occupying the Americas for almost 200 years at this point, so their castles range from the late medieval sort to modern star and diamond fortresses. Whether made of wood, mud, or stone, Buccaneers assaulted them in a largely similar manner. The biggest threat from the forts were the artillery, so they had to be dealt with. Sharpshooters targeted the cannons, aiming for the gun crews and officers. Exchange of fire continued between the Buccaneers and shooters on the walls, with the attacking force divided between a backline of shooters and the ones to assault the walls, usually the forlorn hope. They would either go for the gates with axes, perhaps a petard, or scale the walls with grappling hooks, or preferably ladders. During the attack on Fort Triana, Morgan constructed ladders broad enough for 4 men to climb at once. However, the cover of smoke wasn't enough for Morgan, who took all of the monks and nuns he had captured, forcing them to march ahead of his men like a meat shield, carrying the ladders with orders to fix them to the walls. The governor, undeterred, ordered his gunners to fire at the meat shield. This tactic was repeated at Arica in 1681, when some of Morgan's veterans used prisoners as meat shields, with one of the Buccaneers even referencing Morgan in his journal. During this attack as well, the defenders fired on the meat shields, but also opened up a sally port for them to escape through. Some were left out when the port closed, and they were, to quote Buccaneer John Cox, knocked on the head. Central to Buccaneer assaults was the grenade. It came in 3 basic forms: scatter grenades, fireballs, and stink pots. The first one is the round iron bomb we know and love, and they functioned like a modern frag grenade. The iron shell itself and the projectiles inside would fragment and blast in a deadly radius. They were used for clearing out defenders, and usually thrown into trenches or over a wall to kill or run away the defenders before an attack. The smoke they produced could also be used as concealment. The fireball was a combustible weapon that burned, which could be used against powder magazines and ammunition setups, to run off enemies, destroy doors, gates, and buildings, and so on. The stink pot is the period equivalent of modern tear gas, filled with all sorts of putrid materials, often just literal shit. They produced a disgusting gas once lit that assaulted all of your senses. They were best thrown inside of a building or fortification to force the enemy out into the open. If you're interested in more details about these explosives, I do have an entire episode on them, along with some of the weirder explosive weapons used by pirates and other men at sea. Fighting on walls and inside of buildings was done at close quarters in very tight confinements. This did not prevent the Buccaneers from still using their long muskets. A well-aimed musket loaded with scattering projectiles is still deadly effective at close range, and the musket could then be turned and used as a 2-handed club, or turned into a spear by sticking a plug bayonet into the muzzle. Otherwise, pistols and cutlasses were considered the best close-quarter weapons. Once the walls and gates had been breached, the city lay wide open, and street combat could be absolutely brutal, as the enemy might lie waiting in every window or doorway. Civilians might get caught in the crossfire or get involved in the battle themselves. Terror tactics were often part of street combats, with the Buccaneers running through the streets, just shooting at anyone. Men, women, children, dogs. It would have been a mad cacophony of screams, gunfire, war cries, and frantic barking. Soldiers and civilians would barricade themselves inside the buildings and fire at the attackers from roofs and windows, barricades blocking the street. It would get bloody, with Basil Ringrose writing the following of the street battle in Arica. But our rage increasing with our wounds, we still advanced, and at last beat the enemy out of all, and filled every street in the city with dead bodies. Urban combat was, and is, frustrating, maddening. As the battle in Arica continued, the Buccaneers got so tired of taking prisoners that they resolved to just execute them, justifying their crime by saying that it was done against a copper-colored race that never showed mercy themselves. If the battle lasted long enough, the Buccaneers might even have to occupy buildings themselves, in which to rest, refresh, and have their wounds tended by the surgeons. These sorts of urban fights seldom ended well. The Buccaneers were bested at Arica, and urban combat of this style might only be concluded by capturing the governor and forcing a surrender, or by threatening the denizens to burn down their homes and everyone in them if they did not strike. For many, resistance wasn't worth it. The Buccaneers weren't there to kill or conquer them. They just wanted some loot and then went on their way. Nonetheless, a Buccaneer occupation was not something you wanted to experience. After the Buccaneers conquered the city, they would gather inside a church and sing Te Deum, honoring the Lord for their victories. The Protestants would likely proceed with desecrating the church, trying their marksmanship by shooting the ears and noses of the saintly statues. So too would a church or cathedral be used as an infirmary for the surgeons to treat the wounded. It would also be used as a call to garde, or headquarters. Since churches were usually centrally located, the Spanish were unlikely to attack them, it was cool inside, and plenty of communion wine to drink. The regular troops would be quartered in the buildings around the central plaza, usually taking the finer houses for themselves. The men slept next to their arms and ammunition, ready to rise and fight at the slightest alarm. Sentries were set up across the city and would patrol at night, calling out to each other every quarter of an hour, to prevent them from falling asleep. Watchwords were selected, and anyone who failed to respond correctly was to be shot. The denizens of the city were also rounded up and herded into a central location. If the church wasn't used as headquarters, it was usually turned into a giant prison. Either that, or some other church. The Spanish had plenty. From here, individual prisoners would be pulled from their confinements and interrogated. The Buccaneers had developed quite an advanced questionnaire for their prisoners, and wanted to know everything about possible reinforcements, and most importantly, where the denizens kept their loot. According to the Baron de Pointy, the Buccaneers were only good for discovering hidden treasures. The Buccaneers are infamous for their proficiency in torture, most popularized by Alexander Exquemelin's The Buccaneers of America, in which he described methods such as roasting people alive, putting heavy stones on them, stretching them out between stakes. Some have come to criticize Exquemelin, saying that accounts of torture and mistreatment are relatively uncommon. Here it must be remembered that torture and violence was seen as somewhat ordinary in the extremely brutal 17th century. So often it was just seen as part and parcel of any kind of military occupation, and simply not mentioned in depositions. Nonetheless, the Buccaneers did prefer if their prisoners just handed over the loot without having to make a fuss about it, and most of them probably did. And torture is also a sliding scale, with methods going from mild to hard, and a lot of prisoners likely to crack very early. Hard torture and other war crimes like executing prisoners of war mostly seems to have been a result of frustration, revenge, the Buccaneers being blindsided, defeated, or otherwise retarded in their designs. That is besides religious figures, who were murdered on such a regular basis by Protestant Buccaneers as to make it a pattern. Most of their atrocities were horrifyingly mundane. Prisoners were kept in poor conditions, deprived of proper clothing, food and water, unable to wash themselves or properly use the bathroom. Feeding the prisoners was often a big issue. The Buccaneers had no problems feeding themselves, as they would feast on the very finest of meats, fruits, and foodstuffs. But they were usually too lazy to, say, bake flour into bread. The prisoners might be given the privilege of making their own food, given the provisions to do so, or they might be given less than pleasant cuts of meat, such as offal, or the meat from old and overworked farm animals, donkeys, horses, and the like. There is also the topic of sexual assault, a matter heavily associated with pirates, and one somewhat hotly debated, with some believing it was truly an epidemic among them, and others believing it has been overstated. For one, sexual assault was a tragic feature of the post-battle aftermath in most 17th century scenes, especially in the sacking of towns and cities, and it is uncertain if it was any more common among Buccaneers than other land forces of the period. Now, there are scarce few accounts of Buccaneers outlawing rape, but how often it was actually punished, we do not know. After the sack of Cartagena, the filibusters broke the heads of 2 rapists after their assault on a young woman, but it might have been done to appease the populace after the town was sacked 2 times in a row. Indeed, incidents of assault seem to have been more common than punishment against it, and whilst most Buccaneers do not appear to have been inclined to do it, there were enough of them willing to make it a problem. Sexual assault in the 17th century mostly referred to the violent forcing onto someone, but there were naturally cases in which women were otherwise pressured or coerced by their captors. Exquemelin writes how Henry Morgan asked a beautiful noblewoman to lay with him, and when she refused, he locked her up and starved her. Similarly, many women prostituted themselves in return for food and water, and history is full of cases of women befriending the enemy to improve their own standing in a life and death situation. Of course, there were also those who did it because they were actively turned on for some reason or another. It's certainly a taboo. Naturally, the cities were full of prostitutes, for whom the Buccaneers were just another brand of customers. Bartholomew Sharp wrote in his own journal of how he entered a house where a Spanish woman was willing to lay with him after he proved to be a gentleman, at least according to him. Some women might even have used their bodies to spy on or distract the Buccaneers. Robert Searles, when sent by Morgan to capture the treasures of Panama, got distracted by wine and a group of fine women. Were the women just there to enjoy themselves? Were they prostitutes? Had they been captured? Did they deliberately distract the Buccaneers? It's uncertain. It was official policy for the Spanish to interrogate their own women after a Buccaneer assault, since they might have picked up valuable information about the enemy. For this reason, Buccaneers were often sworn to a vow of secrecy, both before and during the campaign, and some officers did not even share their plans with the men. Religious folk could not expect good treatment at the hands of the Protestant Buccaneers, and the number of cases in which they tortured or executed priests and monks without reason are so numerous as to make it a trend. After Morgan's victory at Panama, several monks brought to him were executed. At Veracruz, several filibusters tracked down and murdered Don Pedro Estrada, a member of the Holy Inquisition. They were former captives of his, and had likely learned some of his, methods. If the town was not taken by surprise and alarm was struck, the denizens would evacuate and abscond with their valuable possessions. It was even common enough for Spanish gentlemen to have slaves bury their treasure, sometimes even killing the slave to prevent the Buccaneers from learning of its location. The treasures of the church might be loaded on boats and sent to a secluded cove or up a river. The Buccaneers would send out scouting parties into the surrounding countryside, both to find the lost treasure, the escaped denizens, and supplementary loot and provisions from smaller farms and plantations. If the treasures had absconded by boat, the Buccaneers captured local barks and canoes and rowed out. One filibuster commander, the Sieur de Gramont, even had a tendency to deploy Buccaneer cavalry, the only one to ever have done so. He first deployed his cavalry force in 1678 during his attack on Maracaibo, and then again in 1683 during the sack of Veracruz. These consisted of 100 men riding under trumpet and flag, and the sight of them alone was enough to scare away Spanish irregular cavalry. So, where did they get the horses? They had been taken from the stables in the cities. But where did the filibusters learn to ride? Grammont was operating out of Petit Goave, which had such an abundance of wild horses, so that any man was able to tame one and traverse the landscape at speed. It likely bred a sizable corps of men who were decent enough in the saddle. Grammont's cavalry was last documented in 1686, when he attacked the city of Campeche. Having now grown to 250 horsemen, the troop rode out to devastate the countryside of the occupied city, but they were defeated by 300 Spaniards. It is unknown if they fought mounted or not. Either way, it shows that the filibuster cavalry possessed more bark than bite. All of the loot was amassed in a central location, with the items acquired ranging from gold and silver, luxury goods like spices, cloth, sugar and cacao, not to mention the vast number of slaves taken. However, the biggest profit lay in the ransom of the city and its denizens, another practice common among 17th century armies. The Buccaneers would keep the city under occupation, the citizens imprisoned, and send a message to a neighboring governor to give them the money they needed. Otherwise, they would set the city aflame, and sometimes even kill the prisoners. Sometimes, the ransom was taken in whatever could be mustered, such as bovine herds, butchered and turned into provisions. A common Spanish tactic was to delay the ransom and negotiations for as long as possible, allowing reinforcements to arrive and run the invaders out. If the Buccaneers got frustrated, they might start executing their captives, and even send the heads of the victims as a grim warning. However, the cases of them burning cities are relatively few. The burning of Panama is the most infamous, but this fire was actually started by the Spanish to deny Morganese loot, most of which had been spirited off. Another infamous scorching was Bartholomew Sharp burning La Serena, modern Chile, in 1680. After the loot had been gathered and the ransom paid, the Buccaneers would return to their ships. It was common for them to send for the ships, ordering them to anchor closer to the city just taken, making it easier to haul aboard all of the stuff. If the city had a harbor, additional vessels might be taken, if there was any need for it. And if the Buccaneers were especially lucky, they might find a precious new flagship. Owing to their numbers, outstanding morale, superior equipment, and above all, tactics and training, the Buccaneers of the 17th century were able to overpower the Spanish Main and sack countless urban locations, virtually holding the entire region in a stranglehold. By the early 18th century, pirate attacks on cities were next to non-existent, as were engagements on land. So, what happened? The sack of Veracruz in 1683 was a wake-up call for the Spanish. They deployed more pirate hunting fleets to the region, improved fortifications, and even assaulted a handful of Buccaneer strongholds, like New Providence and Petit Goave. 10 years or so earlier, they had started arming the Guardacosta for local pirate hunting, and the proficiency of Spanish forces would only improve in the late 17th and early 18th century, making it more challenging to take them on. Spain wasn't the only nation to change its attitude on the Buccaneers. England, having officially made peace with Spain in 1670, began to shift to conducting trade with the Spanish instead of looting them, and arresting Buccaneers who became a nuisance to this policy. In 1688, England even allied with Spain against France, forbidding their Buccaneers altogether from attacking them, in favor of going against their old ally. The French continued to support the Buccaneers, but became increasingly apprehensive as well. In the 1690s and early 18th century, it became more common for regular European forces to become involved in Caribbean conflicts. Regular naval forces incorporated the French filibusters, and commanders often found them difficult to deal with owing to their independent spirit. They wanted to do things their way and were often considered lazy and undisciplined. Furthermore, the Buccaneers had basically looted almost every location there was to feasibly loot. Many Buccaneers realized that, while large companies allowed them to attack cities, the loot also had to be divided between these massive ranks, with the shares often being small. They soon found it to be more profitable to operate in small ships and attack merchant vessels. Though some filibusters and privateers continued attacking settlements in the 1700s, it became increasingly rare. Furthermore, their tactics declined as the old generation of veterans died out, and the younger generations found it less and less useful to utilize these tactics, and so not passing them on to the next. Therefore, pirates lost their proficiency in fighting battles on land. Their attacks were limited to descents, small forays against isolated farms and plantations. The pirates of the 1710s and 20s were few in number, their crews seldom scoring above 200 men. Only 400 to 600 were active on New Providence at its height, compared to the 1,200 or so fighting at Panamá in 71, or the 2,000 commanded by Gramont in 78. However, there were a scarce few echoes, memories of the old tactics, still stirring. Henry Jennings, when he attacked the Spanish salvage camp in Florida, marched under drum and banner, each of his men armed with a musket. The Spanish defenders were racked by disease and surrendered without a fight. Blackbeard blockaded the city of Charleston, burned Guadeloupe. Bartholomew Roberts took a fishing town in Canada without a fight, and some pirates managed to take over slave forts in Africa. Usually, they were poorly manned, the garrisons on the verge of desertion. None of them ever seemed to have faced an epic land engagement on the scale of what the Buccaneers fought. Some pirates, many of them former Buccaneers, ended up on the island of Madagascar, where they sold their mercenary services to local chieftains. Some of these pirates ended up as petty warlords themselves, commanding armies of local warriors. Former pirate John Plantain had crowned himself king of Ranter Bay, and when marching against his enemy, his companies did so under the banners of their leader's home nation, the English, Danish, and Scottish. Whilst there were some gun-armed pirate veterans in the opposing forces, most of the rank and file were spear-armed tribal warriors. How reminiscent these battles were of the old buccaneering days is uncertain, but at this point they had faded away, like the sand from a broken glass. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Golden Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.